Over the course of my career, I have experienced and seen a lot of crazy things that have happened. We're all human and we all do things in real estate transactions sometimes that are a little bit nuts. And I want to tell you about a story. This was not my transaction, but it was a friend's transaction about a seller already under contract to sell their property. And they did something that cost them so much money that it was certainly a regretful situation for them. So, I have a friend, has some buyers that found a piece of property with a pretty house on it, and they made an offer on this property for this home and 7 acres. Buyer and seller agreed and went under contract. And about 3 weeks into this transaction, after inspections had been done, appraisal had been finished, everything had been negotiated out, we were just kind of waiting for closing. The seller happens to mention to his agent that he sold 2.5 acres of that property under contract to his neighbor. The listing agent immediately gets on the phone and calls my friend and says, "We got a problem." And yes, that's a problem. If you are purchasing a piece of property and expect to have that entire property and find out during the transaction that's not the case, that is a serious issue. Our North Carolina contract does discuss situations like this throughout the contract. When you make an offer, that home is to be delivered to you in substantially the same condition, the same size, the same square footage, the same acreage. And if the seller does not deliver that to you, then it could be deemed a seller breach of contract. And that was certainly the case here. It was a seller breach of contract. And my friend called me and she said, "What do we do?" And I said, "Well, let's talk this out, okay? You have a home that's being sold with 7 acres, okay? Now you have a home being sold with 4.5 acres. That's a significant difference. So obviously there is some sort of value loss here. The lender is lending the money on 7 acres, not 4.5. So the appraisal is going to have to be redone if your client decides to move forward. And then you're going to have to figure out if your client is just okay with that 4.5 and seeing the neighbor own the other 2.5 acres. Frankly, that would just drive me nuts. The seller realized after this whole situation that he had made a mistake. And he went back to his neighbor and asked if he could redeem that property. This is not a funny situation, but I thought that was a funny way to try to make everything whole again. The problem was that the neighbor said, "No, I'm not selling you back this property." So there was nothing the seller could do to remedy that. The only thing they could do was work on price, like seriously try to bend over backwards for these buyers. And ultimately the buyers decided to walk away from the transaction. However, because this was a breach of contract situation, and our contracts define what happens in a breach of contract situation, the seller had to completely make whole the buyer. What does that mean, to make whole the buyer? Well, it means that whatever money the buyer put into this situation to purchase this home, including earnest money, due diligence money, inspection money, appraisal money, any money that they have spent to get into this situation, this transaction with the seller, is returned to them. Not only that, buyer agent commission is due at the time of the breach. Our contract says that. So their agent's commission was due as well. And then we had another problem. these buyers had sold their home. They had the expectation of moving out, having a moving company move all of their belongings out, hold those belongings for a few days, and then move into the new home. Kind of almost, not quite a back-to-back, but pretty close within a few days transaction of each other. Well, that's not going to happen now because they don't have anywhere to go. Not only do they have nowhere to go, they don't have anywhere for their belongings to go. So their belongings had to go into storage and then be delivered at a later date, which was going to cost money. And these buyers needed a place to live until they found a new home. And that's a minimum of a 30-day situation, but probably more like 60 or 90, depending on if they can find a home. So at the end of the day, the seller ended up paying this buyer upwards of $70,000 to make them whole. Now, I don't know what that seller made on that piece of property. It was never disclosed. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But 2.5 acres to a neighbor, I can't imagine being, a massive amount of money. It could have been $150,000. I don't think it was, but it could have been. But if you look at how much it cost that seller to make that buyer whole and put their house on the market at a reduced price because of the loss of 2.5 acres, which they did, I promise you it cost that seller more than $150,000. So it's a crazy thing that happened. I'm glad I was not involved. I probably would have hit the ceiling with this transaction if I was the buyer's agent. And I just can't imagine how mortified the listing agent was when her seller said, oh, by the way, I sold 2.5 acres to my neighbor. I think I would have had a heart attack right there. But this is the kind of stuff that happens in a real estate transaction. Now, that's rare. It's a rare thing that would happen that extreme. But things happen. And it's important to have agents that know our contract, first of all, so we can lean into that to remedy situations, but also someone that's a pretty good problem solver in a transaction, because things do come up. It's important to keep your head, even though I probably would have lost mine for a minute in that situation, and negotiate through these issues because, as I said, they come up. I have never done the same transaction twice. There is always something different, and I learn something new every time I sell a home. And this is just a funky story that happened that I thought I would share with you and how it got resolved.